Looks like it's 11 a.m. Thank you for being here. My name is Josh Cook. I worship at the Millview Church of Christ, where I serve as minister. I'm delighted to be invited to speak today and hope that you are motivated, that you see the pathway to maturity in Christ, and most of all, that you see that coming with multiplication. That's what we're going to talk about today, briefly put. Raise your hand if you know Elon Musk. Kind of a world-famous billionaire. He brought us Tesla, the car, created SpaceX. He just recently purchased Twitter and is now going to rename and rebrand that, plus more, as X. But before that, you may not know this, it was Elon that created the first internet mapping system. In fact, that's what led him to create then PayPal. And then from that, he morphed into what we know very well today. In an interview about Elon Musk, Elon couldn't understand why more people in the world didn't think through first principles, is how he put it. Which means this: when Elon set out to build the Tesla, which is an electric car, he did not go and find suppliers for the battery. What he did is he figured out the chemistry, the physics, the legal regulations, and the business acumen that was going to put the battery in his car. In other words, he built it from the ground up. And he says it's first principles that allowed him to do that. And a person with a mastery of these things will do exactly what Elon is doing. In fact, it was mastery of first principles that inspired Edison to do what he did 100 years ago. And it's going to be first principles, believe it or not technology, but first principles 100 years from now, that's going to allow the next generation to do the same thing. Today, we're going to, in this time period, look at what could be called the first principles of discipleship. These things aren't changing. That's why they're first and foremost. And essentially, what is discipleship about? I think it's a movement. I think that's how we can describe it. The passages that have been read throughout this entire Connect conference focus on that. And I just want to introduce 3 points for your consideration today that I think illuminate this. Now, the way we talk about needs some improvement. Last century, Abraham Maslow recognized, he didn't create this, he recognized it, that there is a hierarchy of motivating needs in our life. For example, who cares about that cell phone if you're not even eating anything? It doesn't mean you're not concerned about having access to other things, but if you don't have your earlier needs met, that is driving the focus of your attention. It's your motivation, right? Well, what's amazing about the New Testament is that in Galatians chapter 3, verse 1, Paul describes how the Galatians were represented a Jesus Christ that was portrayed to them. Because that's all you can do once the man has ascended to heaven. How can you introduce Jesus on a name face-by-face basis? You can't do it. The best we can do is come up with a portrait. I don't know what Mona Lisa looked like, but I'm pretty sure Leonardo da Vinci captured her essence. And so what we offer the world is a portrait. That same cue was taken up by the Apostle Paul in Athens. You remember his spirit was provoked. He had seen them worshiping all sorts of idols. And in particular, what he found, and this is what we have to find if we're going to motivate people to become a disciple. We have to find the blank face portrait that they're most eager to paint. Because that's what he did. He took the unknown God, and from that he pivoted and was able to bring them to Jesus. Now, this continues to happen throughout the New Testament. In fact, Maslow's hierarchy recognizes these as the physical needs. Now, John 4:14 is the woman who met Jesus in Sychar. And if you know this passage well, What was she most interested in finding in that moment? The water. Is it an accident that Jesus would relate himself as being the one who could provide for her springs of water welling up or springing up to everlasting life? It's not. He presented himself as being the one that could meet her need. Now, he wasn't talking about physical water, was he? So that's the pivot. Every single need that you see pivots and can be answered by the simple word Jesus. It's our duty to portray that. And that's what we're going to focus on. So, as you move up this hierarchy, Mark 1, 16 through 17, Jesus meets these fishermen, Simon and Andrew, in their trade. They had just finished casting nets. And so how does Jesus present himself? What is he going to offer them? Obviously, these guys are well fed. Did they need a fish in that moment? No. But maybe he's revealing something about where their headspace is. Because one of the things, once our physiological needs are met, we are interested in health, prosperity, employment. This is when Jesus launches a revolutionary idea for these folks. I want to make you fishers of men. I want to pivot your desire to have this need met, and I'm going to lead you somewhere, and this is how we're going to do that. You keep moving up, love and belonging. In Mark chapter 3, verse 35, Jesus' physical relatives come to get him, and those in the crowd around him say, hey, your family's here. And he says, I'll tell you who my family is. Anyone who obeys the word of God is my sister, my brother, my mother. He's portraying himself as the solution that these folks are looking for. Have you ever lost the respect of others? Have you ever hungered to gain it back? If you are in the first century living in Jerusalem and you are a tax collector, you know exactly how that feels. You are like the scourge of the earth. For the tax collector of this day and age, you are a social contagion that must be contained. You represent a diseased, malignant part of the society that needs to be treated. And so it's no accident that meeting these folks, having supper with them, others see Jesus doing this, accusing him, what are you doing with these riffraff? And he said, it's the sick that need the physician. He came to offer them confidence, respect. He came to meet a need, and he saw himself as being the ultimate expression of that. When you get to self-actualization, it doesn't mean you're not thinking about this stuff throughout your life. It means you have all these other base levels of the pyramid met in your life so you can turn your attention to that. Do you know that John the Baptizer was supposed to be the Messiah? In Luke chapter 3, verse 15, people who had been expecting to see the Messiah reasoned in their mind and thought he might be it. Now, he denied it, and rightly so, but that explains a whole lot in John 1:41. When Andrew, who goes and finds Simon, what does he say to him? We found the Messiah. They've been looking. They've been searching for that. Why? Because he represented the purpose and meaning of Israel. That was an expectation, something they couldn't have thought about if they hadn't had these other bases covered. But the point is, the Bible pictures Jesus and redresses him each time an individual encounters him. And it's our job to figure out what that might be in somebody's life. Now, you say, well, these are just random. Actually, it's not. And long before Abraham Maslow developed this hierarchy, Jesus developed the 7 I am. And I want to tell you something. It's not just about figuring out where the person's needs are. If you want to make a disciple, figure out what their need is. But don't just meet the need. Do you know what you have to do next? The I am statements are going to demonstrate something. If I need bread, Jesus will be the bread of life. And yes, that's important. It's a physiological need. So is the light of the world. It's kind of both, isn't it? It's safety and security, but it's also a physiological need. But notice, as John is recording what he records, he's leading us somewhere, isn't he? There's a graduation, there's a progression. And so by the time I get to Jesus being the door of the sheep and the good shepherd, I'm seeing a Jesus that's not only protecting me, but he's going to lay down his life for me. That increases my self-esteem. Now I'm seeing that I have value. I'm valuable because this one is willing to lay down his life for me, a lowly sheep. And this continues through the 7 I ams, the resurrection and life, the way, the truth, and the life. Each of these is manifesting Jesus, redressing his portrait to meet a particular need that we have. And of course, being the true vine, somebody says, I think that's just about life and security and physiological needs. Well, maybe. But Jesus identifies himself as the branch, the true vine, and what does he want to do? He wants to integrate others into himself. That is a purpose statement. That's what we're going to say to people to motivate them. Now, today you may say, I could go up to anybody in this 300-mile radius and say, Jesus is the bread of life. And I promise you, Josh, it's not going to have any effect whatsoever. Well, that could be. There are a lot of people without bread, though. And you know, Jesus wasn't afraid to meet their need, was he? In John chapter 6, he literally met the need of the 5,000. And then by the end of chapter 6, you see Jesus portraying himself as the bread of life. Now, he was always ready to pivot. And today our messaging might be like, look, I don't want you to come to church. I want you to be a part of the greatest revolution that mankind has ever experienced. Look, I don't want you to sit down in a Bible study. What I want you to experience out of your life is the absolute full potential of being a part of the boldest and most inspiring cause that planet Earth will ever know. People are hungering for purpose, and that is ultimately where we should help lead them. Now, it's important to continue to recognize. So what is this main point about? It's just recognizing where people are. And they're not always in the same place. And Jesus didn't try to create a program for just feeding people, although I'm sure that's what the disciples were wanting. At the end of John 6, when many left because of his hard sayings about being the bread of life, I kind of wonder if some of the disciples would go up to him and say, Jesus, we were doing better off with that bread thing. Can you just bring the bread thing back? Look, when you were giving out free bread, man, our numbers were huge. But then you started preaching these hard sayings and folks were leaving. You could almost imagine them. Let's just bring back the bread stuff. They needed to progress. They needed to advance. They needed a different portrait. They needed one that pivoted them. And so, yes, recognize the need wherever it may be. I think this is what we're not doing a good job about. We tend to think everyone's needs are basically the same. Not true. Jesus particularizes a conversation so that it helps that person where they are. And we can do the same. But beyond this, we might say that discipleship is essentially about maturation or maturing. It's about the propagation of something, the cultivation of that thing, the development. I went to a high school where our mascot was a maple leaf. You know how ragged we got on that all the time? At football games, we literally had this guy, I don't even know if he could see, but he slipped into this massive human-sized blue maple leaf and went around the field like this. Now, we were playing against opponents that were called the Pioneers or the Indians or the Bulldogs. And here we are just blowing in the wind, this maple leaf. What's the point? Well, maple leaves don't make really good mascots. But plants, and this is not a maple leaf, that is actually an acorn, so that would be an oak. But plants, I think, provide a really good analogy, a really good illustration for the pathway, okay? If the last point was the gas pedal motivation, then this represents the steering wheel or the GPS. This is where we're going. This is charting out where we go in discipleship from start to end. That's the motivation, that's the goal of these slides. And we're to be like Jesus. He's the example. We follow his footsteps. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. No disciple can be more than his teacher. No servant can be more than his master. At best, we can hope to be on par or enough to be like that one. And that's Matthew chapter 10, verses 24 through 25. In the process of converting people, there was more than that. Not only did Paul preach the gospel, and then through that he made many disciples, Acts chapter 14, verse 21, he went back through on his first missionary journey, retraced his steps, and what did he do to all the Christians that were just formed? He strengthened them, he exhorted them, and he told them, life isn't going to be easy for you, but stick with it. So there was maturation, okay? It's not just about getting a human being wet through baptism. Here are some, I guess, a way to walk through it using the analogy of the plant. So, seedling faith. You're just starting out. You hear about Jesus, you got to evaluate him. You got to do something with him. It was the wedding feast at Cana where the disciples first believed. But it wasn't just about being impressed by a Jesus that is portrayed to you. You discover there are actually commands. There's something to hear and to respond to. And Jesus himself says, my sheep will hear my voice. John chapter 10, verse 27. So the seed is coming. And the seed of truth arrives, and it's always the same. And hopefully we're dealing with the right seed. That's why it's so important that we emphasize truth and sound doctrine. Because if we give them the wrong seed, look at what's going to be corrupted all the way around. But also, I might point this out, that occasionally we think about the seed as being the gospel that we read, but we don't often think about what the seed will become. And the seed ultimately will become what? A viable, mature plant that also gives seed. Every single convert, if they had that built-in understanding of what discipleship is, when I become a full-fledged disciple, what I'm doing is what somebody just did for me. That continues discipleship. So it's important that we show the end, start with the end, see where this thing goes, which is why this is a useful illustration. But upon hearing those commands, we have to calculate the cost. Jesus said, you're going to have to give it up for me, Luke 14. And guess who said, I did give it all up for you? Peter, Matthew chapter 19. He analyzed the cost of what it was going to take to follow Jesus, and then he delightfully accepted the challenge. So his soil was ready. We have to answer the call. I guess this would be likened to conversion, but also in the case of the early disciples, they were not always eager to go with Jesus for the long haul. How do we know that? Because he called them no less than 3 times. 3 separate occasions Jesus called the disciples. I think growing up reading the New Testament, I was always under the impression that after reading John chapter 1 and the call of the disciples, that was it. They just followed him for the rest of those 3 or so years. Not true. John chapter 1 is the first time they're called. Mark chapter 1 shows us chronologically what happens next. John is in prison, Mark chapter 1 verse 14, then Jesus calls. Well, wait a minute. In John 1, it's before he's in prison. Because some of the disciples leave John and go get the others. That's a second call, folks. He had to go back and call them again. I don't know if their profession got in the way or family life, but he had to go retrieve those same disciples again. And then the third time in Mark 3, this is when he formally identifies the 12 apostles from the whole lot of disciples. And I would even suggest, if you'll permit me, that John 21 might be a fourth calling in the instance of Peter. Because how did he call Simon Peter to begin with? He said, I'm going to make you a fisher of men. Well, what is he doing in John 21? The Lord has already resurrected. They're at a beach after Peter was just fishing. But he was fishing for fish. He wasn't fishing for men. I don't think it's an accident that Jesus' question to him is, Peter, do you love me more than these? And grammatically, the these is not the other disciples. Grammatically, the these are the fish that lay just feet away on the fire, grilling. The ones Peter just caught. Do you love me more than your occupation? Because Peter, I'm going to take you someplace. You're going to go somewhere. You eventually don't want to be there, but I want you to be there. I think that's a fourth calling. And We have to answer the call. And guess what? In discipleship, it may mean you call once somebody to become a Christian. You may call them twice. Sometimes we're not good at continuing. We'll say, well, man, I had these Bible studies, and then this moment of decision came, and they didn't respond like I hoped. I guess I'll just go on to somebody else, maybe. Or maybe you stick with it a little longer. There is a famous author who, when he wanted to break out into writing, decided to be realistic. And so on his wall, he drove into the wall a nail. And as he would submit articles and papers and novels and such, he would get back the rejection letters. He had so many rejection letters, and this is what he would do. He would take that and pin it right there on the head of the nail. And he would get another and he'd pin it. And he'd get another and he'd pin it. You know, he reached a point when he literally couldn't press the papers any tighter, and he had another letter. I think maybe if it were me, I would have said, well, there it is. That proves that I can't make it as a writer. I better just give it up. He went and got a bigger nail. And that author's name is Stephen King, which may be one of the most popular authors on planet Earth. What's the point? It may take more than one call. We got to be prepared to go the long haul with this. Now, eventually, got to wipe that dust off your feet, as the Apostle Paul would say, because there are more souls that need to hear the gospel. But it's important that we not give up. So if they finally do come to Christ, they're not coming to me, they're coming to Christ, they're not coming to you or to the church. I know that's a thing we just kind of always say together, but emphasize Christ. That's the portrait we're painting. Now we're trying to dig down that taproot of conviction. So they're going to get to promote the calls. I remember reading this passage in Mark 9 about these other disciples. Like, they weren't the ones with Jesus all the time. They were just these other ones. And they were doing things in the name of Christ. And the ones that were following Jesus very closely were saying, hey, can you go tell those guys to stop that? And Jesus said, let them alone. He who is on our side is for our cause. And maybe they didn't know everything, but they were advocating for the Savior, weren't they? They were promoting the cause. That's important. And we need to see that in the development along our own discipleship and the discipleship of others. We got to start owning the concern. I'm sure it was strange to the disciples when Jesus would say, you have to bear your cross. There was no cross that they were seeing when he said that. The cross wouldn't come till later in his ministry. What do you mean, bear my cross, Jesus? They kind of just tucked that one away, I guess. And then when he went to the cross, I think they got it. Oh, I need to own this cause. I have to take ownership. I have got to invest myself in this. This is not just something Jesus did for me over here. He's actually asking me to go over there with him. Well, that's a different angle of discipleship. And this is the taproot of conviction taking place. You got to have a trunk of strength. It's funny, in storms, you see the wind blowing at trees, right? And I've seen the biggest, most massive trees are the ones that end up like falling over and just breaking off. And they're so rigid, and that may be why. And in the New Testament, our faith that's pleasing to God is likened to a small child. And when I think about a tender shoot of a plant, it's so viable. It's still green, but it's viable. And guess what the wind does to it? Nothing at all. It's able to go with the ebbs and flows of life. It's able to handle that. And so Jesus needed his disciples to be able to weather controversy. That big one happened at the end of John 6 when he decided to preach on himself being the bread of life and others leaving him. When Peter and the others are asked, hey, are you guys going to leave too? You remember the words of Peter, ones that grip us. He said, Lord, to whom shall we go? You alone have the words of eternal life. They weathered the controversy, and then they reciprocated the commitment. This is an essential element. If you abide in my words, you will be my disciples, John 8:31. And let's not forget that throughout their experience of being Jesus' disciples, There were others in the world that were portraying their choice as being against Moses. There's always going to be a naysayer in the life of a new convert, in the life of a disciple, that's going to challenge somebody's love for Jesus more than their acceptance by whatever is normal. And when those things appear, and maybe it's in the case of this blind man who was healed in John 9, who was getting interviewed, is a nice way of putting it, who was getting basically taken to the stand and questioned about Jesus. He said, "Oh, do you want to be his disciple too?" And they said, "Well, you're that man's disciple, but we're Moses." As if that was better. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 4, as if the one who is a servant in the house is better than he who built the house. But they didn't recognize Jesus at this point in their life. But fortunately for that blind man, and hopefully his disciples, they stuck with him because they recognized there's no alternative to Jesus. Now, eventually we're going to move into this phase called the sowing faith, where we're going to be involved in everything. Tabitha was known for her good works, Acts 9. We have to mount charges. We can grow weary in doing good. And the Bible's answer to that is double down on doing good and meeting cases of urgent need. Why? Because if I don't do that, I may be unfruitful. And so I've got to contribute something. Titus chapter 3, verse 14. Flowers of fellowship. I couldn't do any better than this. I apologize. Flowers of fellowship. That's a weird point. It's always been weird as I say it. Flowers of fellowship. But go with me on this, please. All right. We're going to be in perfect agreement with everybody we ever meet inside the church, correct? We all come from so many backgrounds, it's just not possible. But Jesus instills in us the pattern to do that very thing, to be supportive. Jesus took it upon himself to be the one who first was going to act. I'll wash your feet. And as your master and teacher, remember what I'm doing, because that's how you're going to act like me. I've been training you to be me in life, and this is something you're going to have to do for others. If you're going to be a disciple, you have to let me do this. So you have to let others serve you, beloved. That's sometimes harder than serving others. But once you allow that to happen, then you are trained and get to enact your own version of service for others. And again, how is the world going to know that this group over here belongs to Jesus? Because of their love for one another. Verse 35. It's not just going to be people of your skin color or your nationality. The world is full of Christians. There are Christians in war-torn parts of the world. There are Christians in parts of the world that have no electricity. There are Christians everywhere. And Jesus came to where there might be hostility, end it. And so what I accept about what this tree of discipleship is, it's going to involve an expanded cooperation. I'm going to work with my enemy in some cases to serve the Lord. Now, ultimately we get to the fruit of the Spirit. And I don't want you to think at this point that this means converts. I know sometimes when we look at passages like John 15, verse 2 and 8, where Jesus identifies himself as being the branch, and he says, I'm the true vine, and if you're in me and you're producing fruit, my Father will clean you or cut you so that you can produce more fruit. And if you drop down to verse 8, he says, so that you can bear much fruit. So it's bear fruit, bear more fruit, bear much fruit. There's a progression there, which is hinting at where we're going next. But this cornucopia doesn't have to be other souls. That's where we're going next in the success in faith. But here it's just, are you manifesting the characteristics of Jesus Christ in your life? Never mind trying to convert somebody else at this point. Because the testaments that they'll be looking at are the New Testament and you. Sometimes we get the cart before the horse and we say, well, Jesus will be happy with me when I'm bringing disciples to him. Are you bearing fruit first? Do you exemplify Jesus Christ? And when you're at that point, when you can say, yeah, I am. Obviously, I'm not saying I'm I don't sin, or I don't make mistakes, or I don't do it as well as Jesus did. But I'm ready to say I bear fruit for him, and that things have been removed from my life so that I can bear more fruit for him. And I've done it so long to the point where I am bearing much fruit for him. And that's the pinnacle of a sowing faith. But that's not in. Successive faith. You mean none of this other stuff is successive? Well, by definition, do you know that in forestry, there are terms called the first succession plants, followed by the second succession plants, followed by the third succession plant. So literally, success is in this idea of reproducing another life form that's just like you. In this case, we're talking about a spiritual person, a disciple. And that is the definition of success, when you've replicated others that are just like you. See, your oaks, your maples, your tulip poplars, those are first succession plants. They can grow up in the hot sun, they can take the heat and few resources. But the ones that are more sensitive, that come up later, these are like your eastern redbuds, your dogwoods. They don't get as high. Why? Because they like to grow within the understory of those other big plants. What the apostles and disciples represent with Jesus Christ in the first century are these first succession plants. And they did more things than we will ever do because they're the first succession plants. But they paved the way and made it possible for all of the seeds that they would drop to become the next generation of that discipleship, because it's a movement after all. And so how did they do this? Well, they understood context. I'm sure the scripture has been brought out a lot this week. We need to become all things to all people. That shows you have an understanding of somebody. You're listening to them. Basically, everything in these 2 points is what we already covered in the first part of this lesson. If I'm having those intentional conversations, if I recognize the needs of others, I'm providing constant motivation. And I didn't point this out, but do you know what causes a person to enter into this stage, and this stage, and this stage, and this stage, and so on all the way through? It's motivation. What motivates me to become a Christian isn't what motivates me to become an elder one day in the church. Nobody puts on Christ saying, "I'll make a great elder someday." But eventually this need hits them because they've been graduating and progressing. Well, it's the duty in discipleship to constantly put the next need in front of somebody. And when they meet it, celebrate it, and then say, "Here's another need to consider." That's what keeps people going around this cycle and moving to this point, which is the climax of germinating the gospel in new soil. Some people do that. They're the evangelists. They speak. They teach. Other people are involved in grafting in the new converts. What does that mean? It's your Tabithas. They're the people that are interested in helping people in life make the transition out of the world and into Christ. It's important to them, and they want to keep doing it. Their role in evangelism is just as important. It's just as important as sowing the seed. Grafting somebody in, making them feel like they're a part of the community of God, that is a necessary and essential part of discipleship. And that's why it's featured here. What does that involve? Well, you're guiding converts. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I need a mentor in my normal roles of life now that I'm a Christian. That's what Paul calls Titus to provide, the church where he worked. He said, have the older men live a certain way, have the older women live a certain way, and teach the younger women. What are they doing? It's the church discipling the church. It's the church helping the new ones graft in, understand their role from a societal view. But then there's our role in the church. Somebody may be a servant. Somebody else may be a deacon. Somebody might be a missionary, an elder, a preacher, an evangelist. Somebody may be a Bible class teacher. All of these roles function and work together. There needs to be training. This slide right here and this point right here is the basis for Connect. It's why Connect exists. It's why somebody had the idea, we need to do a Connect conference, and why other lectureships exist in the brotherhood. It's because this is how we disciple, through this which means if we bring more people to something like this, they're gaining in their own discipleship. They're learning what it takes to help lead others. And then we're enabling compounding. I love this verse, this series of verses. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 12 through 15. This is one of my favorite things that Peter ever wrote, said, or did. Because it's him saying to his audience, while I'm in this tent, and he knows he won't be in it forever, he says, I'm going to keep stirring you up by way of reminder, even after I'm gone. And there's something that happens with old, aged trees. They're not just scooped off and taken to heaven. That would be a funny thing if every tree went to heaven when it died. I don't know what that would even look like. No, they stay right there and they begin to decompose. And everything that was built up in them goes right back down to the soil where they had just scattered a bunch of seeds, where they had just spent their life grafting in new limbs into the branch of Jesus Christ. And that is a beautiful image, that we leave a legacy even after we're gone. That it's our goal, that's the conclusion of discipleship. It may have been that bread that caused my attention to go to Jesus, but it's going to be the fact that I'm going to give bread that's going to define my goal in life, my drive, my ambition. That's my purpose in life. And that's the discipleship from start to finish. But Stephen Covey taught us, you want to reach the end, begin with the end in mind. And so we look at this. Now, there's another thing that happens as we move from the seedling faith all the way around to the successive faith, and that is leadership changes. Early on, when Jesus called his disciples, he was the leader and they were the followers, right? They saw him preach, Matthew chapter 4, verse 23, around the cities of Galilee. And then as they saw that for a while, he said to the 72, which included his 12, hey, now I want you guys to go over there and you're going to do the preaching. I don't think it was so that Jesus could take a break, but I think he's doing this. He's preparing them what? Not to have an example of leadership, but to be the leaders. And so it's, even though John said, there's got to be more of Christ and less of me, even Jesus did this. Even Jesus said, okay, I know it's my ministry and overall it's my mission, but I've got to step back if they are going to take a role. If we don't include that in discipleship, then somebody is just constantly depending on somebody else. And we're not training for the next generation of leaders. And so there has to be this swap, which is naturally why Matthew 28 is Jesus going to heaven and just the disciples going out. He leads them to be the leaders. He showed it, and then in a limited way, he eased them into it, and then in a full-blown way, he stepped back and let them have it. That's what our life will reflect if we're following discipleship the way the New Testament puts it forth. Now, golden spiral. This is our last point of the morning, and I appreciate your attention. I like math stuff, and I've had a chance to teach on this. So those examples you see up there, the sunflower, a spiral galaxy, the eye of a hurricane, the aloe, and seashell. I don't know what that plant is up in the upper right, but there is a Italian, his name is Bonacci, but we know him better as Fibonacci, Leonardo Fibonacci. And he recognized a pattern that shows up in nature. And you'll see these numbers here, but I want to show you what he recognized. What he saw is that if you have 1 by 1 as a box, so just deal with 1. What's the number you have prior to that? Well, I don't have a number, so that's 0. Okay, we'll add it. 0 plus 1 is what? 1. Okay, so draw another 1 by 1 box. All right, I'm with you so far. Okay, now you're at that 1 by 1 box. Now add the previous number. Well, that would be 1. Well, what's 1 plus 1? Oh, it's 2. Well, array that 2 by 2 box in such a way that you get this rectangle. Okay, I see where you're going with this. Now I have 2 by 2. What's the previous number? 1. What's 1 plus 2? 3. So now draw a 3 by 3 box. Now, can you predict what the next one will be? Go ahead. 5. And the next one after that, 8. And the next one after that, 13. And the one after that, 21. And so all you have to do is add the previous number with the one that you're at currently, and that gives you where you're going. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because in discipleship, the last illustration analogy is a little misleading. It looks like it's just a circle that comes back on itself, but in fact, what happens in Christianity is something much more incredible. It spans the globe. It's that incredible. And so that's what we want to talk about next. Because our spiritual productivity is the first thing. In the parable of the sower, there was good soil. It's by no accident that Jesus said, some yielded 100, some yielded 60, and some 30. Because maybe my first produce is 30. But Jesus leaves the option that later it could be 60. And still later, that could be 100-fold. And it's the same little old me that he's using as the good soil to produce all that. In fact, he gets right down to it in the parable of the minas in Luke chapter 19, where he noted how the one who had been given 1 talent or 1 mina, a currency and amount, he didn't do anything with it, and it was taken from him and given to whom? Given to the one who got 1, who made 10. He was given 10 more, and then he was added the one. And the one in the middle who had 1 and gained 5, he got 5 more cities, we're told. That is, you got this sum, and you did well with it, and so now I'm going to take that you've done well with, and I'm going to give it back to you. But what do I expect? You're going to do more with it. This is spiritual productivity. This is why you can never answer the question that is often wondered by Christians. What are all the things I have to do in order to be saved? You may be able to answer that question for Judaism. In fact, you can. But you cannot answer that question in Christianity, because Christianity it's a spiral. It's a progression. Paul uses the language more and more. Let your love abound more and more, Philippians 1:9. Live to please God more and more, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 1. Aspire to lead a quiet life, mind your own business, and work with your hands that you may walk properly toward those who are outside. More and more is the phrase associated with that. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 10, which is why this is not something that you can articulate within a set of commandments. Because the love I show this year, it's going to be better next. All right, you got it. Now, the church also grows dynamically. This is likened to a living being. Jesus said, I'm going to build my church, but it was Peter who told us that out of living stones. And he said it was constantly being built together. There's nothing static about that. It's like an organism, isn't it? It's very dynamic that way. And I'm not going to live forever. And Paul recognized that about Timothy, his pupil that he was mentoring, the evangelist. And that's why in 2 Timothy 2:2, that's the passage, I think, that in the New Testament cements this idea of multiplication. Because each of us won't be around, what can I do with what was given to me? I just walked into Christianity. I wasn't here from the inception. And unless the Lord comes back, I won't be here at the end. I'm a link in the chain, literally, and that's a good thing. That's something we should aspire to. So he gives the instruction. As I've given these teachings to you in the hearing of all, you, Timothy, commit these to other faithful men who will be able to teach others. And that's the multiplication at work. It's discipleship. If we have discipleship conceived of in any other way, we don't have the essence of discipleship. And this is really reflected in the book of Acts. In the book of Acts, I think, by the way, this is a very helpful outline of the book of Acts. And the major 2 points would be from 1 to 12, that's a focus on Peter, and from 13 to 28, that's a focus on Paul. That might be the overarching division of the whole book of Acts. But we tend to think about Acts chapter 1, verse 8, and Jesus saying, no, the Holy Spirit's going to come on you, this promise, in where? What city? Jerusalem. And everybody says, yeah, but we know it didn't stay there. We know it went to Judea next, and it did. But then we know Jesus said it would also go to Samaria, right? And then Jesus said it would be going to the ends of the earth. Well, it's not just territory that we're talking about. The multiplication is in people groups too. Because in Acts chapter 1 through 7, you have these witnesses, the disciples, the apostles, they're bearing witness of Jesus Christ's gospel from Jerusalem to Judea to the Jews. And then that's expanded, not only in territory, but in the people themselves. And so we get to a point where the gospel is being witnessed to God-fearers from Samaria all the way to Syria. This is happening at the end of chapter 12. And this continues to grow, bearing witness to Gentiles from Asia Minor, even as far as Achaia, which is part of modern Greece, in 13 through 21. And then the entirety of 22 through 28 is Paul on his way to Rome. But what that represents is a level up in the kind of person he was going to reach. It doesn't mean that this person was better. It's just by prophecy, Jesus said, you will be my witness to the kings of the earth. Well, he had to go talk to the king of the earth at that time, who happened to be the Roman Caesar. And the book of Acts ends tantalizingly, by the way, with us not getting to witness any of that, but on the cusp of him speaking to the highest ranking human being that other human beings would rank on the planet at that time. That would be Nero. And so that's where the book of Acts takes us. And I just want to very quickly show you the missionary journeys of Paul, how they keep radiating out. So this is the first missionary. And then look, here's the second missionary. He's gone even further on this journey. His third takes him out and then back in, covering some new places, even from the first two. And ultimately we know that's going to take him where? It's going to lead him all the way to Rome. Now, in a discussion about discipleship, you can't help but see that there's actually a spectrum that leads us to missions. And I don't want to explain any of that right now, other than to say Christ started it. I learned it from an apostle or his words. And then I practice it and help another. At that point, we have a church. What do you get when you have more than one church? You got a brotherhood. What do you get with a brotherhood over time? Christianity. Well, is there anything beyond that? Yeah, the kingdom. We're all going to be in the same place that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are going to exist. The kingdom of God is going to be a wonderful place, something that we can't experience to its full magnitude just yet. So where's this lesson? It's like right here. But there's a whole lot more we could discuss. I appreciate your attention, and if I could just end with this. It's a movement. The essential thing about discipleship is that it's a movement. There is movement. There has to be constant movement. And the movement, almost like how your clock, the series of gears, if a smaller gear spins enough, it turns a larger gear. And if a larger gear turns enough, it turns an even larger gear. That's happening throughout Jesus' Christianity. You know, from my day to day, what am I most concerned about? On a daily basis, there are 24 hours in a day, and the earth rotates once. You get day and night. That's it. That's like the scale of your motivation in discipleship. But there's a scale beyond that. Because as this globe that we're all on rotates, how many times does it rotate before it goes around the sun once? 365, because that's how many days are in a year. And a year is one revolution around the sun. I'm constantly motivating and being motivated, and I may not realize it, although I can tell. Look, in a day's change, it's very dramatic. There's night and there's day. But I can tell the change even over a year. What gives it away? If you live in a area like us, we have seasons where you can see the change in the color. Even the daylight changes some, the cooler temperatures. There's evidence that I'm maturing. But I have to account for that in days. It's not in hours. And then there's one level that we will never account for. Because if the astrophysics is right, it's 240 million years for where the solar system is to be able to in one pass come all the way back around on its spindly spiral-shaped arm about halfway out, the Milky Way galaxy. Now, we've never made a pass once because the Earth is only 6,000 years old. And if the Lord doesn't come back for 240 million years, that's hard to even fathom at this point. But if he chose not to, I guess we would go one time around on the Milky Way. And I didn't start that movement, and you didn't either. It's like being at the fair, the merry-go-round, and you see how much fun it is. You're attracted to it. Somebody grabs your hand and pulls you up. That person then steps down and pushes. You think this is a great ride, and then you realize, it's my time to push. I want to keep that going and going. And when you have that thinking, you are, in essence, being discipled. And as we consider the host of parables in the chapter of Matthew 13, parable after parable after parable of the sower, parable of the weeds, parable of the mustard seed and the leaven, parable of the pearl of great price. All of these parables are pointing to lessons about the kingdom. They're different portraits of God's kingdom. And then Jesus asks his disciples, have you understood this? Do you see what I'm doing? Can you see that I'm taking the same thing and I'm trying to offer a different portrait? And I want you to pay attention to that, disciples, because that's how you're going to motivate the kingdom moving forward. You're going to offer them, and parables are great at this, you're going to offer them a glimpse into the kingdom, but more than that, you're going to offer them a portrait of me. Because at the end of the day, technology will change. As Elon Musk and Edison, as whoever the guy was that invented the wheel, have proven over and over, technology changes. But the essence are the first principles. They don't go away. They may get repackaged and dressed up differently. But at the end of the day, people have hunger. People desire for ultimate meaning. People need a pathway to move forward, a goal, an aim. And they need to realize that it's going to be bigger than themselves. And if we do a good job at that, the world will respond. And that would be discipleship. Any comments or questions?
You guys have a book poem or something?
No, sir, but I will make these slideshows available to anybody who wants them. They're easy to email. It's not a large file. All right, if there are no questions, we'll just formally dismiss. Thank you.